What is advocacy all about? Well, if somebody becomes a justice impacted person, meaning they're going into the criminal justice system, it's a concept that people need to learn, that this is a long, ongoing process. It is not an easy fix, and sometimes it can have really lethal consequences if you don't advocate for yourself effectively or appropriately. And too many people who are going into the criminal justice system really don't know anything about the system when they're going in. So they get charged and they go through this process of having to rely upon their defense attorney, and their defense attorney may or may not be there to help them all the way through the journey. That's why it's so important for every justice impacted individual to really learn about what they can do to prepare themselves in the event that things don't go right. Now, the lawyer will everybody has a right to counsel through a criminal proceeding, and that lawyer may be there to help an individual through the pre-charging time, through the time that an individual enters into a plea agreement or goes to trial. If there's a conviction, then through the pre-sentence investigation report, and then through sentencing, and possibly through an appeal. But once a judge sentences a person, the individual transitions from the judicial system into the executive branch of government, which in the federal system is the Department of Justice, and that means the person's going to go into the Bureau of Prisons. But the Bureau of Prisons is a really huge agency that has a lot of complexities, and it's just really incumbent upon every individual that's going in there to truly understand it. And that's the reason we publish so much free information on prison professors, because we really want people to be able to advocate for themselves when challenges surface. Sadly, many of those people will not have a defense attorney there, and they may have opportunities to either work towards getting out, transitioning to home confinement sooner. They may have opportunities to work and participate in programs that can advance their release dates. They may have opportunities to advocate for themselves in other ways that really improve outcomes for themselves, not only through prison, but also when they come home. Sadly, sometimes people need medical care, and that medical care is found to be substandard. And if that's the case, a person really needs to know, how do you build an argument that will perhaps lead a federal judge to order the Bureau of Prisons to do something, to act on behalf in the favor of the individual. And the person really has to learn about things such as the Prison Litigation Reform Act, the Administrative Remedy Plan, and also a proper release plan, and also figuring out, how do I navigate this very complex system? I have to realize it's a big machine, and in that big machine, I'm only a little cog, and I've got to figure out, how do I work my way through this big machine so that I can get something that's working on my behalf. I can't change the machine, at least not while I'm a prisoner. I was in prison for 26 years. I was 163-77004. And although I worked every day on an advocacy campaign while I was in there, I was always a prisoner. It wasn't until I finished my obligation to the Bureau of Prisons that I could start beginning to work as an advocate and as somebody who's trying to help other people get the best outcome for their life. And that's what we're trying to do here. And today what I'd like to do is I'd like to read an article that a website known as The Reason published, which shows just how important it is for somebody to learn how to self-advocate and learn the battle that they're going to have ahead of them. And this really just gives a deplorable accounting of what happened and how a federal judge ruled against the Bureau of Prisons, actually holding the Bureau of Prisons in contempt. Now, I'm going to read the article in its entirety, because some people gather their information from prison professors, from our iTunes channel or from our YouTube channel, and they may not have time to sit there and read, but they can listen. So a lot of people consume this content while they're walking, while they're driving, or even if they're in prison, they may be walking around a track listening on some of these audio devices. So I want to read the article, and I will be providing commentary as well. But if you visit the website at Prison Professors, you can download all of the PDFs that I'm going to be citing here. And then I'll write a little bit of commentary as well that people can consider, because I do think people need to have their eyes open and understand what they can do to help themselves better. So this article was published just yesterday on October the 10th at 12:30 in the afternoon Eastern Time by somebody named C.J. Sierramella. And I'd like to read what her article or his article has to say. So a federal judge wrote, the title of the article is "Judge Holds Federal Bureau of Prisons in Contempt for Allowing a Man to Waste Away from Untreated Cancer." A federal judge wrote that the Bureau of Prisons should be deeply ashamed of medical delays that resulted in a man dying from treatable cancer. And for those who are listening on iTunes and are not able to see the article, what you'll see there is an emaciated man who's lying in a hospital bed. He doesn't appear to be in prison because he is wearing clothes that the prison wouldn't allow. I'm making that observation by looking at his red socks and looking at the shirt that he is wearing, which I know is not prison issue. So I can tell that this person is in a hospital outside. But let's continue with the article. In a scathing opinion, a federal judge held the Bureau of Prisons in civil contempt and levied sanctions against the agency last week for allowing an incarcerated man to waste away from untreated cancer, as well as for willfully ignoring and misleading the court. U.S. District Judge Roy Dalton from the Middle District of Florida wrote that the Bureau of Prisons should be deeply ashamed of how it treated the now deceased inmate Frederick Bardell. Its actions, he said, were inconsistent with the moral values of a civilized society and unworthy of the Department of Justice of the United States of America. Bardell was convicted in 2012 of downloading child pornography from a peer-to-peer file sharing website and sentenced to 151 months in federal prison. But he was not sentenced to death by medical neglect, and he was ostensibly protected by the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, as are all incarcerated people, no matter how heinous their crimes. That includes the right to basic health care behind bars. Nevertheless, the BOP allowed a highly treatable colon cancer to progress until Bardell was terminally ill, all while insisting in court that there was no evidence he had cancer and that he was receiving appropriate, timely care. In addition to holding the BOP and Christy Zook, the warden of Seagoville Federal Correctional Institution, in contempt, Dalton ordered the BOP to pay Bardell's parents nearly $500 to reimburse them the airline ticket they purchased to get their dying son home. Dalton also requested that the Attorney General and the Office of Inspector General for the Justice Department investigate the circumstances of Bardell's death. It takes a deeply rotten culture, and this is a quote. This is a quote from a federal judge. No, strike that. This is a quote from Kevin Ring, who's the president of the criminal justice advocacy group FAM. It takes a deeply rotten culture to make otherwise decent people act as these prison officials did, Kevin Ring, president of the criminal justice advocacy group FAM, says. The BOP is in desperate need of independent oversight. Medical neglect in U.S. prisons and jails is an ongoing constitutional disaster. Earlier this year, federal judges also held the Arizona and Illinois prison systems in contempt for failing to address gruesome medical neglect within their walls. The infamous Rikers Island jail complex in New York City is also under threat of being put in receivership by a federal judge because of chronic corruption, violence, and preventable deaths. Reason also reported in 2020 on several allegations of fatal medical neglect inside FCI Aliceville, a federal women's prison in Alabama. Earlier this month, bipartisan legislation was introduced in both the House and Senate that would create an independent ombudsman to act as a BOP watchdog. Criminal justice advocacy groups say Bardell's case is exactly the sort of incident that makes such a position necessary. Bardell filed a motion for compassionate release, a process through which terminally ill inmates can be afforded the comfort of returning home for their last days, in November of 2020, arguing that he likely had advanced colon cancer. An affidavit from a doctor accompanying his motion said he had a high likelihood of having cancer of the colon with likely metastasis to the liver. The BOP and federal prosecutors, in their opposition to Bardell's motion, argued that while Bardell had liver lesions, no one had determined his condition was life-threatening. They assured the judge that Bardell was receiving adequate medical treatment. Dalton denied Bardell's motion. Bardell filed a second motion for compassionate release in February of 2021, this time with an affidavit from an oncologist. The oncologist wrote that more than a year-long delay in getting Bardell a colonoscopy after he first noticed rectal bleeding allowed this tumor to progress from stage 3, with an average cure rate of 71% in November 2019, to stage 4 disease in September of 2020. I mean, that's less than a year. So in a year, he went from having colon cancer with a 71% cure rate to stage 4 disease. That delay, the doctor stated, would more likely than not cost Mr. Bardell his life in a matter of weeks to months. The government again opposed Bardell's motion, arguing, as Dalton summarized it in his opinion, that it was not even definitive that Mr. Bardell had cancer, let alone terminal cancer. This time, a disgusted Judge Dalton ordered the BOP to free Bardella as soon as the U.S. Probation Office crafted a proper release plan for him. But the Bureau of Prisons defied Dalton's order and instead immediately released Bardell. The prison directed Bardell's parents to pay nearly $500 for an airline ticket to fly their dying son back home on a commercial flight. Although he had to be pushed out of prison in a wheelchair, a BOP van dropped Bardell off on a curb outside the Dallas-Fort Worth airport without a wheelchair and left him there. Bardell was weak, as well as bleeding and soiling himself, but he managed to navigate the airports, layovers, and connecting flights through the help of Good Samaritans. When he arrived back in Florida to meet his parents, his father had to take off his own shirt and put it on the seat of Bardell's lawyer's car to absorb the blood and feces, Dalton's opinion says. Bardell died in the hospital 9 days later. Pictures accompanying Dalton's order show Bardell severely emaciated. And here's a quote from the federal judge's opinion at length. While the sanctions imposed are remedial in nature and restricted by law, the court admonishes the Bureau of Prisons and Warden Zook for their blatant violation of a court order and sheer disregard for human dignity. The Bureau of Prisons as an institution and Warden Zook as an individual should be deeply ashamed of the circumstances surrounding the last stages of Mr. Bardell's incarceration and indeed his life. No individual who is incarcerated by order of the court should be stripped of his right to simple human dignity as a consequence. The purposes of incarceration, which include rehabilitation, deterrence, and punishment, do not include depriving a human being of the fundamental right to a life with some semblance of dignity. The treatment Mr. Bardell received in the last days of his life is inconsistent with the moral values of a civilized society and unworthy of the Department of Justice of the United States of America. The court is hopeful that in some small way, these proceedings will illuminate the BOP's arrogant and wholly mistaken notion that it is beyond reproach and the reach of the court. It is not. If any institution should embody respect for the rule of law, it is an agency that operates under the aegis of the Department of Justice. This court will do everything in its power to ensure that the Bureau of Prisons is held to account for its demonstrated contempt for the safety and dignity of the human lives in its care. The Bureau of Prisons did not respond to a request for comment. Now, separately, to provide a little bit more context on why this is so important, I will go ahead and create separate video blogs with commentary on our website at Prison Professors for you to see that this is not an isolated case. And I'm thankful to the people at Reason for publishing these other articles that bring this atrocity to our attention. This article was also published by C.J. Ciaramella on July the 1st, 2022, and this one is titled Federal Judge Rules Gruesome Medical Neglect in Arizona Prisons Violates the Eighth Amendment. A third article is here, published on August the 11th, 2022. That was the date, incidentally, a coincidental date. That was the date that I was arrested back in 1987, August the 11th. This one says, federal judge holds Illinois prison system in contempt for inadequate medical care. And here's another one from June the 30th, 2020, also by C.J. Ciaramella. These women received a death sentence for being sick in prison. And so Reason, it seems to be a really strong public service advocacy group that's bringing attention to people. Here's another article from September the 30th, just a couple of weeks ago. Bill introduced to bring independent oversight to the federal prison system. And so there is a lot of attention being brought down upon a government agency that confines more than 100,000 people. And I think it's our job. I mean, there are a lot of advocacy groups out here that do amazing work. There are advocacy groups like FAM, who brings a lot of attention to policy and the request for legislative change. There are public policy initiatives like Justice Alliance that work to try and reduce the amount of revocations that send people back to prison. There is recidivists, I think they're called, that does a lot of data analysis to try and help directors of prison systems and stakeholders in capitals, legislative capitals, help them understand what does the evidence show that we could do better. Our job at Prison Professors is a little bit different. We really strive to help people who are in prison figure out, what can I do to help myself given the circumstances that afflict people in prison. And as somebody who did a quarter century or 26 years in federal prison, I feel like I have a duty and an obligation to help you understand the system so that you could understand, what can I do within the system to get the best outcome for my life, regardless of what other people are doing. And we can't solve the problem for everybody. All I can show you is that, hey, these are the strategies that you can use. So on this article, I'm going to download all of the court documents, and at our website at Prison Professors, you could just really simply, with one click, go to the PDF and you'll get all of the information, including the articles from this particular, what I just read about the sad case of this person who died. You will also get the court filings, which are a matter of public record. And you could figure out, how can I use this information for myself? But I'm hopeful that when you get into this system, if you're going into the system, you are going in there with your eyes wide open, you understand what exists there, and you're figuring out, these are things that I can do to help myself. And it's very important. It is a very heavy lift. I had to go through all of those challenges. And I was thankful that I didn't have medical complications, but some people do. Many people do. And I know the battles that somebody has to fight, but I also know the mechanisms, and the mechanisms don't always work, but you've got to use them. You got to know what levers to pull, and that's what we're trying to teach people here at Prison Professors. Learn how to help yourself. I am Michael Santos, and on behalf of our entire team, we believe in you. Thanks.